Ever since I started my work in politics, I have heard stories and rumors of something sinister happening in South Africa. I was regularly sent images and videos claiming there was a white genocide going on right now. As a journalist, I have learned to never take anything at face value, to second guess and question it all. But I also believe that there is never smoke without fire. This is what makes South Africa so intriguing, because depending on your outlook, it is either a paragon of multiculturalism and social justice, or a powder keg with a genocide against the white population ready to erupt into an all-out race war. After doing some digging, I found an overwhelming mess of conflicting information about South Africa. Political turmoil, disappearing government funds, widespread corruption, and the sense that those responsible are never quite brought to justice. I found stories about the most gruesome murders imaginable with almost no statistical proof of their existence. I tried to put the pieces together, but there were just too many missing. With the left wing and establishment media calling the farm murders a non-issue and praising the Rainbow Nation, and the far right predicting a civil war, I thought surely the truth must lie somewhere in the middle. To understand South Africa today, we have to understand South Africa then, 366 years ago to be precise, when the wheels of history were set in motion. It all begins in 1652, when the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, became the first European group to establish a permanent settlement on South Africa's western coast. At this time, the rest of the country was inhabited only by the Khoisan people, an ancient nomadic group who foraged the land long before the black tribes migrated south into the modern-day KwaZulu-Natal. The VOC made its first purchase of land from the Khoisan people in 1671, establishing the Cape Colony in the areas surrounding what would become Cape Town. But it did not treat all under its rule well, and many children of the settlers were born into indentured servitude. Seeking a life beyond the VOC, a group known as the Trekboer set out beyond the borders of the Cape Colony in search of a free, semi-nomadic farming life in the country's interior. They were joined by the first of the Voortrekkers in 1836, a larger group that would eventually form the basis of South Africa's modern Afrikaner population. As their great trek reached its peak, war erupted among the Bantu tribes in the north as they migrated across the modern South African border. In 1816, a king named Shaka ascended to the Zulu throne. Within a year, he had conquered almost all of the neighboring tribes who were vying for control of the region. This period is known as the Mfukane, the Zulu word for crushing, scattering, or forced migration. In 1823, a rebellion under Mzilikazi split off from the Zulus and headed north into the Transvaal region, where it is estimated between 1 and 2 million Bantu people were massacred, leaving the area almost completely depopulated. It was during this time that several tribes, the Mfangu and the Ngwane among them, were forced to flee south, putting them on a direct course for the trekking Boer. This was unfortunate for the Boer, who had been making deals with smaller tribes in the area, trading favors, livestock, and weaponry for land. These deals between the Boer and the Bantu occurred frequently throughout South Africa's history. It wasn't long, though, until fair and mostly peaceful exchanges of land between whites and blacks gave way to violent, militaristic ones. In 1828, a new Zulu king, Dingane, took the throne. Piet Retief, a notable Voortrek leader, was determined to make civil deals with the tribes. He was granted land for his caravan of Voortrekkers in exchange for the return of 700 cows that had been stolen by a neighboring tribe. After returning these cows to the Zulu, Retief and his trekkers made settlements on the agreed-upon land, and in a show of good faith, the king invited Retief and a band of his men to witness a special performance put on by his soldiers. There was no show. Instead, the soldiers restrained Retief and marched him and 100 of his men to a bridge where they were beaten to death, leaving Retief for last, so he would be forced to watch the murder of his men and his son before he himself was killed. Dingane went on to massacre Retief's entire encampment, including hundreds of women, children, and many Khoisan people who had traveled alongside the Voortrekkers. The incident became known as the Wenen Massacre. While the Boer advance across the country was mostly peaceful, the Bantu tribes fought ceaselessly, killing white, black, and Khoisan people wherever they found them. In 1910, following the surrender of the Boer to the British, the Union of South Africa was formed. It comprised all of the now established colonies and united them as one legislative union. For a time, separation of blacks and whites was only a social convention, not the rigidly enforced legal structure it came to be. But after the election of the National Party in 1948, what we now know today as apartheid, a word that quite literally means separateness, was formally introduced across South Africa. A slew of new laws, including bans on mixed-race marriages and the Population Registration Act, which required people to register as black, white, colored, or Indian, were all introduced. And many of the descendants of the Bantu tribes were moved to the Bantustan areas, known today as the Black Tribal Homelands. In all aspects of life, blacks and whites became separated, often almost entirely. In the 1970s and 80s, apartheid became the focus of a global pushback. The UN brought sanctions, while internal resistance to apartheid began to find greater support. In the face of both peaceful and violent resistance, the National Party began a brutal crackdown. The crackdown only radicalized South Africa's anti-apartheid activists even further. In 1961, Nelson Mandela, then a member of the South African Communist Party, co-founded the Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the African National Congress that rules the country today. The group, often abbreviated to MK, publicly announced its existence with 57 bombings on one day. Ultimately, with the help of the CIA, Mandela was arrested and spent the next 27 years in prison. During this time, the resistance to apartheid only became more radical. In 1986, Mandela's wife Winnie publicly endorsed the new trend of necklacing, a form of execution used against blacks thought to be collaborating with the government. they would be forced to wear a rubber tire filled with petrol around their chest or necks before being set ablaze.